talk to you about restoring watersheds for salmon. And I think before I start, I wanted to ask a few questions. How many of you here in the room have done any habitat restoration? And what kind of work was that? Was it? What's that? Coastal oysters. Anybody else?
Meadow restoration.
Yeah, meadow restoration. Good. How much do you think we spend on watershed and stream restoration in the US every year?
5 billion.
Anybody else? Well, Ray's guess is probably good. 20 years ago, there was a study that showed that we were spending about $1 billion a year in the US on river restoration. Nobody's got an updated estimate, but I think in the Pacific Northwest, it's probably safe to say Bonneville Power Administration spends about $250 million a year on mitigation of fish and wildlife restoration and mitigation for their hydropower system. The Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund for the last 20 years has been giving the states $50 to $100 million. The states of Washington and Oregon have been state funds into that, probably 20, 30 million a year each. Pretty safe to say that we're probably in the Northwest spending $1 billion a year on river and watershed restoration. So it is a $1 billion industry. I don't know what the number is nationwide because I haven't seen a recent estimate of that. And I think you know why we're so interested in restoration. Obviously, there's a lot of our rivers are degraded and polluted. I think riverine habitats are some of the most degraded across the planet. The extinction rates are much higher in freshwater than other areas, and habitat destruction and loss is kind of the main cause. And when we look at a particular watershed, these impacts are across the whole watershed, going from the headwaters, from forestry and road building and mining, and then getting down into the floodplains and the valleys, which are some of the best fit habitat for salmon, fish, and wildlife, but that's where people live. So you've got all kinds of agriculture, industrialization, and urbanization. And that leads us to the Northwest and the West Coast, where most watersheds along the West Coast have 1 or 2 species of anadromous salmon listed as threatened or endangered. That doesn't include other species, doesn't include bull trout and other species. So pretty much most of the watersheds have some endangered fish, and there are thousands of projects. NOAA has a database that doesn't capture all the projects in the Northwest, but they have about 40,000 or so projects in that database and counting. And this map just shows some of those. So in the Columbia Basin, and I'll talk a little bit specifically about the Columbia Basin later, but there's really a high intensity because BPA is funding so much work there. It is probably one of the largest, if not the largest, restoration program in the country and probably the world in terms of the amount of investment that's going on there. You probably have heard, what I've always heard anyways, is that restoration ecology is a young field. And by that, I think the term was coined sometime in the 1980s. It became much more popular in the 90s. But to be honest, river restoration has been going on for more than 100 years. So it started in the late 1800s, 1880s, or into the early part of the 20th century on gamekeepers and private landowners or fishing clubs started putting logs and brush and things in streams to try and improve habitat for trout and salmon, particularly in the UK and Europe. In the early part of 1920s, 1930s, we saw this get expanded. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which there's a picture here from crews working in a stream in Montana, put in thousands of what we call in-stream structures. So basically logs, log weirs, like this kind of Lincoln log structure here, which is actually from the 1990s in a stream down by Mount Rainier on Forest Service land, but put in thousands of those structures across across the country. And a lot of those techniques were developed in the Northeast and in the Midwest for low gradient, low energy streams. Starting in the 60s and 70s, people started applying those in Western streams, and our higher energy streams, they saw a lot more failures with those structures. But we saw you went from the 1930s and 60s, a lot of log structures, a lot of riparian protection and fencing out cows because there had been massive overgrazing. So they were doing some riparian stuff in that early period. But then into the 70s and 80s, more of this kind of structural stuff, putting in rock weirs or wood weirs, constructing spawning channels like this one up on Bambine Lake, but also constructing off-channel ponds and stuff, particularly in the Northwest and in Washington State to create habitat for coho salmon, because this was before all the listings of ESA listings. But if we move into the 1980s, the 2000s, we started seeing some other techniques. Natural channel design, which is really creating meandering channels where we had all these straightened streams. Engineered log jams, when we went to moving to try and get those wood back into really big rivers. How are you going to do that? Well, the engineers came along and said, we can build a great big log structure in the river that mimics a natural one. And then more floodplain restoration, at least in Europe. They were way ahead of us on doing floodplain restoration, partly because a lot of their stuff, they have a lot more low gradient streams, particularly in Western Europe. And then when we moved into probably the last 20 years, we saw going into dam removal, continuing to construct some side channels or try and get some of these side channels back that we've lost when we straightened a lot of these rivers. And then a bunch of different structures that were meant to try to on the low-tech side, structures that we called post-assisted log structures like this picture here, which is all done with by hand crews, and trying to mimic beaver dams or beaver dam analogs to try and get beavers to colonize those areas. And then the most recent technique that's come up has been called stage zero restoration or valley reset, where they said, hey, let's just regrade the entire valley and then let the river flow across it and find its way and create a new channel. Only can do that in some places, like on Forest Service land, but that is a technique that's been coming up. So there's been a whole evolution over the last I guess it's not 150, but getting close to that. And so there's a whole suite of techniques. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but stuff that deals with roads, removing roads, forest roads, reducing impervious surface area. Seattle's one of the leaders in that for urban roads. Riparian planting, livestock removal, removing invasive species, a whole suite of floodplain restoration projects that include pulling levees back or removing bank armoring. And then a lot of emphasis on in-stream placement of wood, particularly in the Northwest, where our streams have really reduced levels of wood. And a lot of that is to try and create pools and spawning areas for salmon, that in-stream work. So there has been, my colleagues and I, when I was at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, put together a guide. Really, it was a textbook for our class we were teaching here occasionally at SAFS. But really, we're trying to get the key components. There's a whole suite of things and a whole different aspects of science that go into designing effective restoration projects. So this was really to try and help guide these projects. And there are a number of key components to this. Then some of there's simple things like goal setting, but there's a lot of these things like that are really, I could give one talk about any one of these, like assessing to understand degraded habitat and the kind of methods we use to do that. When we talk about salmon, trying to identify their limiting factors and what are the degraded habitats and what's really the bottleneck that's limiting that population. How we prioritize restoration projects, designing the restoration projects, which sounds like mostly engineering and construction, but there's actually quite a bit of science that goes into that. And then evaluating restoration projects. And as Tom said, I did my PhD on that, but we've continued to do more and more work on that. And I'll provide some examples on the Columbia Basin and probably provide a little more emphasis on that. That tends to be one of the more experimental approaches or science there. And the Columbia Basin is one of the biggest ones. And we recently completed a large evaluation of some of their restoration projects. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, kind of some of the key aspects. So assessments, assessing the conditions. And this is really trying to understand the processes at different scales throughout a watershed. And, the simplest way to describe these processes is the delivery of wood, water, and sediment. and what are the historical conditions in the watershed, the current conditions, what's that change, and where are restoration opportunities. But you've got to do that at multiple scales, because some of these things are operating at a watershed scale, some at a reach scale, and then some are even smaller than that. So there's a lot of different, particularly with the remote sensing that's come in, these things are evolving really rapidly on how we're evaluating and trying to find where those restoration opportunities are. And when it comes to restoration in the Pacific Northwest, and I should say the West Coast, it's really about restoring these habitats for salmon. That's where most of the money is coming from. And so there's a number of different life cycle models that have been developed to try and look at this. And really the more complex ones and the more recent ones are linking together a whole suite of models, including vital information on the different survival and other things, to try and really what we're trying to get at with this is a few different things. And I should say they link together the vital rates with all this habitat information and the amounts of lost habitat and the different processes, really with trying to understand what are some of the limiting factors. And so the key things that we're often getting out of this are, what is the limiting habitat and life stage for fish? Am I walking too far from the mic, by the way? Well, you get, I guess it's being recorded, so I hopefully they can hear me over here. Examining different management and restoration scenarios. One of the key challenges though here is that with with the computing power and with the more complex models we can do, it's not necessary that we're collecting more field data to populate those models. So sometimes you see some very complex models that are still using some vital rates on egg to fry survival or something that's 20 years old. So there is a real need to get some field data to populate that stuff. But this is an example on the right, just from work from Tim Beachy in his HARP model that has been a good model that brings together some of the more traditional Leslie Matrix and Beverton Holt models with some of the watershed processing stuff, but examining some different restoration scenarios in the Stillaguamish Basin to see how much we might see increases in Chinook numbers if we do these different types of restoration actions. Prioritizing restoration projects. And this, once you've identified all those areas that need restoration, we have to figure out which of those to do first. The life cycle models can help with that, but there's a lot of other factors that go into determining which projects to do first or in what sequence. Historically, this was done with professional opinion. 20, 30 years ago, one of the regional biologists or a tribal biologist would just decide, this looks like the best place to do it. That's where we're going to work. And then sometimes you were doing it if there was a refuge area, or determining if there was based on a refuge and that type of thing. But most people are using some kind of multi-criteria decision analysis, which is really a fancy way of saying they're using a basic scoring and ranking system with different criteria that they score. An example, this is an image from the Middle Nenema River where we did an assessment and identified a bunch of identified a bunch of different restoration opportunities there. For each one of those, we have what was degraded, what the assessment told us, what kind of restoration actions it probably would be. And then we worked with the local partners to select criteria, score those criteria, and rank projects. And then they grouped them into groups that they were going to go after. Not very complex, but more recently, we've been using applying mathematical optimization to try and figure out what is the best suite of projects that's going to give you the biggest bang for the buck, given a certain budget, given certain criteria and constraints. And Sunny Jardine in Marine Affairs, or SME, I guess is the acronym for that, has done a good job creating an online tool that does that, an optimization model for looking at culvert replacement in the injunction area for the U.S. versus Washington culvert case. And we see that mostly applied with culverts and barriers, but we're seeing more and more people, as those tools are easier for people to use, we're seeing that applied to some of these other restoration actions across an area. I think that's really where things are going to go on when it comes to prioritization. And then, as I mentioned earlier, design and implementation. There is a lot of engineering and construction in here, but a lot of we get detailed information from hydraulic modeling to get depths and velocities and how that's going to change. And actually, we can model the amount of suitable habitat. So you can take the outputs from the hydraulic model, which are typically using a topographic surface that comes from LiDAR. And we're able to get the depths and velocities. We can take the habitat preferences or curves, and that's some of these curves showing the depth and velocity preferences for, I believe these are for juvenile Chinook, and you can estimate the amount of suitable habitat or how that changes under different restoration scenarios. Now, it's not perfect. It's not the same as fish abundance, but it does tell us that, hey, we're creating what you're likely to create the right conditions. More recently, you're seeing adding food web modeling to that, adding some with, I think one of the models that's out there is the net rate of energy intake. So you could try and predict, looking at the primary productivity, the primary, secondary productivity, and predicting what that's going to do to fish biomass. But it also incorporates some of the inputs from hydraulic modeling on, so you can look at drift and how the fish are feeding and that. So another area that's been kind of growing and expanding in terms of this. So the next part of that is, okay, we need to understand that if you build all these projects, we need to understand their effectiveness. And despite the massive investment in restoration, Ray's probably not off. There's probably $5 billion a year nationwide, certainly at least 500 million to $1 billion in the Northwest. There isn't that much spent on monitoring. Still less than 10% of the money is spent on understanding whether these projects are effective. In addition to that, most of that monitoring is not effectiveness monitoring, but implementation monitoring, which is just, did they build the project the way they say they were going to? They said they were going to put in 1,000 logs. Did they put in 1,000 logs? They said they were going to remove a levee. Did they remove the levee? So it's still an area that we need some additional information. And no place is this more apparent than the Columbia River Basin. At least for the, 10, 15 years ago, both NIMFs, the Northwest Power Conservation Council, their independent science panel were telling BPA that they needed to do a programmatic approach to evaluate their restoration projects. They've been funding lots of monitoring evaluation of projects, but it was one-offs on individual projects. And when they tried to roll that up, they found out they couldn't say much about this massive program and these different project types. So when I was still over at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center back in 2012, they came to me and my colleagues and asked us to help develop a monitoring program to evaluate these projects. One of the aspects they had a couple constraints that they wanted us to have some of the data collected by partners. And for certain project types, they wanted us to use a particular protocol that they developed, which led to some problems in the monitoring and evaluation. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this program because it's some of the latest work that's been done, and the results are pretty indicative of what we found for in other areas or individual case studies on these different types of restoration. So the questions for this are really the questions that most funders and a lot of practitioners are asking about projects. What is the effect of a particular restoration technique on habitat and fish, particularly at the reach scale? That's a tractable scale where we can measure things. Why are some projects more successful than others? And then one of the other questions that BPA and NIMS had was, hey, what are there differences among ESUs in that evolutionary significant units? Because they wanted to know if some of these are, some parts of the watershed or the basin, the Columbia Basin, we're seeing bigger response than others. Spoiler alert, we didn't find any differences among ESUs, so I'm not going to talk about that one much. So a couple things that they wanted out of this was that they had thousands of projects that they've completed already, and they've got hundreds more that they were going to build. So we wanted to both be able to evaluate some of the previously completed projects as well as some of the new ones. So we used a couple different monitoring designs. For the completed projects, we use an extensive post-treatment design That's sometimes called a control impact design. It's just paired treatments and controls that you're comparing post-treatment. You're not evaluating individual projects. You're usually sampling 20, 30 or more projects, and you're looking at that average response. And then a multiple Bakke design, a before-after control impact design, which has long been considered the gold standard, applied on newer projects. As it turns out, applying a multiple Bakke design with a bunch of partners collecting data and then BPA mandating a certain protocol can pretty much ruin that design. And we really found that a multiple Bakke design is very difficult to implement on more than a handful of projects. But we did get some very good results out of the extensive post-treatment design on existing projects. So we ended up sampling more than 120 projects across the Columbia Basin over a 10-year period. And I'll go through some of the results for each one of these. We looked at barrier removal projects, wood placement projects, riparian planting and invasive removal, and floodplain restoration projects. And those are some of the most common techniques out there. So first, I'll talk about barrier removal projects. And we looked at complete barrier removal projects, meaning it was a complete barrier to fish passage, or at least so we were told, before there was any restoration. So we didn't necessarily need pre-project data because we knew anadromous fish couldn't get up there or hadn't been documented up there in a long time. And so it was really just a simple comparing below and above the culvert, doing some multiple removal electrofishing and some habitat surveys above and below to see if some of the quality of the habitat was driving the numbers of fish that we see above and below the barrier. And the reality is that what we're trying to see here is that if it's a success, there's no difference in those numbers of fish above and below the barriers. And these are just all the sites we sampled. I want to say there was 30 something, and we had identified out of BPA had, I don't know, 300 or 400 projects that they'd implemented since 2005, but only about 30 or so of those had suitable upstream and downstream reaches. And I think we couldn't sample a few because of access or fires and stuff. But these are all those projects. And what you see is those bars are not very different. And in fact, there's no difference before and after. And actually, that's a good thing when we're talking about a barrier removal project. So, at this point, it's not really, and there's been enough studies on barrier removals. It's not any, new news that if you remove a barrier, we'll get fish up there and they'll colonize it. What we found is they colonize it very quickly. So the age of the project didn't matter. Within a year, fish were up there. And we've even seen sites where they've been removing a barrier and fish will start moving upstream within a few hours. So they colonize very quickly. And that's why there's so much emphasis on barrier removal, because we know we can get fish in there. We're not having to try and improve the habitat to get a fish response. On the barrier project, so, it was highly successful. There wasn't any relationship between project age and fish numbers above and below. The one thing we did see with this is there was a lot of projects that were supposedly for Chinook salmon, and they were very small streams, and they were not, we didn't find any Chinook in them. And so part of it was just they need to do a better job of prioritizing where they do the barrier removal. So large wood placement is the next category, and this is one of the most common techniques. And you saw that history. There's a long history of placing wood in streams going back 100 years. We had a whole bunch of projects in the BPA database that we could draw from. We found a little more than the 30 that had suitable treatments and controls. We were able to sample 29 of those. In this case, we used snorkel surveys and the treatment and control reaches. Long profile habitat surveys. We also counted wood, but it's not any surprise that the wood numbers would go up if they were putting wood in the channel as part of the restoration. But we wanted to look at the wood to see if it does tell us something about why some projects were successful and others might not be. I'm going to show you a number of these kind of bar graphs they're simple bar graphs. They just have the ratio of the treatment to control. So that's kind of the multiplier. So that would be 1.5 would be a 1.5-fold increase or 50% increase. 2 would be a 2-fold increase or 100% increase. And what you can see here is, first of all, what we've seen in other studies where they do wood placement, if the wood placement is done right, we see a pool increase in pool area of about 50%. Most of these projects placing wood are trying to increase pool area because juvenile coho, steelhead, and chinook really, they like those pool areas and they respond well to that. And that's the kind of habitat we're trying to create. So that's good. And then these are some of the other fish species. We were mainly focusing on those anadromous fish, steelhead, chinook, and coho. These are all juvenile fish counts. But you can see that the numbers are 2 to almost threefold higher in the restored versus the unrestored reaches, or the treatment versus the controls. Now, the other benefit of doing this extensive post-treatment design is the extensive part. We have all that replication, and we can try and understand why some of these projects are more successful than others. And what we saw, and this was what some other studies we've seen that we've done on the coast with sampling a lot of streams, that there's a strong correlation or a decent correlation between the fish response and pool area or functional wood. And by functional wood, we mean wood that's creating pools. Because what we see in some wood placement projects is they're putting the wood on the side of the channel and it's not really interacting with the channel. It doesn't end up creating pools. It doesn't end up trapping gravel. So the projects that are most successful are the ones they put that wood into the low flow channel and it's interacting, creating pools. So, these projects, they're pretty successful, the wood projects. There is quite a bit of variability in their success, but the ones that are most successful are the ones where they're putting a lot of that wood into the low flow channel that's creating pools and habitat. Now here's the one, riparian planting and invasive removal. BPA's database had more than 2,000 riparian planting projects. And the one thing about riparian planting is many of these projects are inexpensive and somewhat opportunistic. So they might have a field crew that doesn't have much to do. Why don't you go out and plant some trees? So they're not always well thought out, but some of them are, they range from something that might cost a few $1,000s to ones where they bought $100,000 worth of plants to replant a floodplain. But there's a lot of these projects across the landscape. But when we looked at the database, we realized there really were only about 1,000 sites, because a lot of those they went to the site multiple times and replanted trees. But the other thing that happened is that the location, when we thought, okay, we're going to have a stratified random sample. We got a huge sample to draw from. We're going to sample 60, 70 projects. Most of those sites we couldn't find. They weren't the right location. And we ended up having a little more than 40 that we could find suitable treatments and control, and we could locate the product. But we measured kind of the typical things in the field that people do when they look at riparian, looking at the plant richness, the diversity, the abundance, shade, cover, those kind of things. Our biggest challenge was just finding sites. This, again, one of these graphs just showing that kind of that ratio. And we saw, some improvements in species richness, meaning the richness of the riparian vegetation, woody plant abundance, abundance of shrubs and other things. Now, you see one there that says browse. So if you plant trees and you plant shrubs, deer, elk, and beaver show up to feed on those. So they're more of the plants had browse because there's more food there now. So we were attracting some. The other thing we did is we looked at a whole bunch of different covariates to try and understand why maybe some of these projects were more successful than others. And so we used a random forest model. This is some of the higher scoring things, and really the things that were driving this. And this is the interior Columbia Basin. So it's not Western Washington. The plants, like in Western Washington, we can see a meter or more of growth on a planting in a year. Not in the interior Columbia. So the climate, the precipitation makes a big difference. The water table, in a lot of cases, people are planting these things on what was former floodplain, but now the channel's in size. So the plantings, unless they're watering the hell out of them or they're planting really deep, they don't do very well. And then whether they're protecting them from predators, in this case, predators or herbivores. And the age of the project, which is also related to that climate issue. It's just going to take longer for them to grow the more arid the site. So these the riparian projects are successful, but it's highly variable. And in a lot of, we didn't see a response of shade and other things because probably just the time. Now, we had sites that were up to 10 years old, but I think the things is the time for the plants to recover is a bit slow. And really the climate and precipitation and other things make a big difference in the success of the projects and whether they're doing any kind of follow-up treatments like watering or replanting. Biggest issue with the riparian, and we see this in other databases for restoration. The riparian stuff, a lot of it is done a little bit off the cuff, and so they don't document things as well or put as much thought into it as they do some of the more expensive techniques. So floodplain restoration projects, and this is, what time am I supposed to stop at? I know you're leaving. Okay. Okay. So floodplain projects. This is really where a lot of the effort has gone in the last probably 10 years, because a lot of the earlier restoration was done in headwaters on Forest Service lands, but really the good salmon habitat, particularly for Chinook, is down in the lowlands. So floodplain projects. When we started this off, we were going to use a multiple backy design for this. And we had, like, we're ambitious. We're going to look at 30 or 40 projects. All kinds of issues with the contractors and the partners that BPA and the protocol that BPA said we had to use for floodplain projects, which didn't actually measure the floodplain, but the in-stream habitat. So we kind of had to throw out that design after a number of years when we realized that wasn't working. But we did, over the course of this project, and we did the floodplain projects towards the end, there have been more and more floodplain projects completed. So we used that extensive post-treatment design. We had to totally update our methods for this and really did a number of studies to look at what are the proper metrics for floodplains. What about using LiDAR or drone-based LiDAR or some more modern methods to map the whole floodplain, because doing it with a field crew, with a total station, or trying to have them use old school stick and tape approaches just doesn't work on the floodplain. So we completely updated the methods. And then we had ended up sampling 17 sites with paired treatments and controls, which is just about on the low end of the sample size you need for a post-treatment design. Did I skip that? Yeah, so we mapped the floodplain and the habitat and looked at fish numbers. So some of the results from these are a whole bunch of floodplain metrics. And one of the big things we're trying to do with floodplain projects is, one is reconnect it with the flood, the channel with the floodplain. So get either the channel bed up or the floodplain down. But most cases getting the channel up, and get more side channels. These side channels are really important for rearing fish, for salmonids. So we have a whole suite of metrics that deal with side channels, and those generally responded. Now, these are a whole suite of flood. Some of these projects, they constructed side channels. Some of them, they just pulled back the levee. Some they remeandered. Some they put wood in to to interact with the floodplain. So there's quite a big variability, but they were generally doing a decent job at creating side channels. There's a couple of indices we used, a river complexity index, which is kind of looks at somewhat the side channel in the morphology, and then a morphological quality index, which is something the Europeans developed that's quite good. But so a decent response for the floodplains on some of these floodplain metrics. Whoa, what happened there? I'm sorry about that. In-stream habitat, the response was okay. We saw some increases in percent pool area in pools. The wood counts went up, which is no surprise. They put a lot of wood in here. And then on the fish side, for the juvenile salmonids, real strong response for coho, which is interesting because they were just recently reintroduced in the last 10 or so years in the Columbia Basin to the interior Columbia. And and so not a lot, actually, I think only half the sites had juvenile coho, but the numbers were so much higher in the restored ones than the unrestored. And then a good response for steelhead. It was really odd that we didn't see a response for juvenile Chinook, because they tend to be intermediate in their habitat preferences between coho and steelhead, and generally like pools. But we had pretty low numbers of juvenile Chinook at the sites, and really only half the sites had juvenile Chinook. So I think that's a little bit has to do with our sample size. So the floodplain projects, there's some real improvements. These are some images of some of the projects we looked at. Significant response for coho and steelhead. We think the Chinook has something to do with our sample size, though the Chinook response was correlated with slow water habitat and complexity. So the projects that really increased that a lot, we did see some improvements in the Chinook numbers. What we found here is using a combination of field and LiDAR data, we can efficiently monitor these projects. And we used a combination of drone-based LiDAR and then some supplemental field data to do that along with snorkel surveys. So, if we look at all these projects that were done under the Action Effectiveness Monitoring Program for BPA, full barrier removal projects, really strong response. I didn't talk about it. Partial barrier projects were really a mixed bag because everyone they had fish above them, anadromous fish, before they were replaced, and they were, depending on the project, we didn't see any changes in their numbers, probably because it really depends on when they're impassable. They don't appear to be impassable to juvenile fish, a lot of those, so not a very strong response. Wood projects, most of these are showing a strong positive response. The riparian plantings, a mixed bag on those. And the positive floodplain projects are having a positive response. We had adaptive management recommendations for the practitioners for each of these project types. But there was one thing that's been occurring over the course of this, which is, for the last 20 years, we've been telling the practitioners, you need to do bigger projects. Most of those projects that we looked at that were built between 2005 and 2020, most of those covered maybe 500 meters, maybe a kilometer. We've been pushing people to do big projects that cover, this is a map of the Middle Eniat. That's an 8 kilometers of main stem channel. And so people have been doing that, but the methods that we've been using historically to monitor restoration projects aren't adequate to map projects of that size. If you're going to send a field crew out there to do it with a total station or even an RTK GPS, it's going to take them a month to actually adequately map a large, several miles of river, maybe longer. So a couple things happened. Our report to BPA on the Action Effectiveness Monitor, one of our recommendations is, hey, you need to develop some methods for evaluating large floodplain projects and riparian planning projects, because the approaches you've been using and the project sizes have increased and the historical methods are not working. Same recommendations came out of the Salmon Recovery Funding Board program, their programmatic approach. And we were contracted to develop a study plan and to test out a bunch of remote sensing methods for monitoring large floodplain projects. And for the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, and I just wanted to touch base on that because this is where we're applying a lot of these newer techniques and newer analytical methods. So we were really trying to look at this and say, okay, we need to test some of these approaches for evaluating come up with a method for evaluating large floodplain projects. And I'm talking about projects that are bigger than a couple kilometers, typically 5 to 10 kilometers of river and several hundred hectares of floodplain habitat. We need some, the problem with these really big projects is they don't lend themselves well to a backy design. It's hard to find a control when you're talking about, 10 kilometers of river being restored. So looking for something that we can do it with a simple before and after design. And the reality is, if you're doing that much restoration, I should be able to see the changes on, 10 kilometers of river and several hundred hectares of habitat. I should be able to see that in the images or in some basic tables. The differences should be big. If they're not, we're not really restoring much. So we wanted to do this simple before after design, and we can demonstrate some success with some simple graphics and percent change. We also were looking at trying to provide more information on those designing projects on the design. We're getting more and more from the practitioners saying, okay, what specifically do I need to change about my design? So our methods for this were to use green LiDAR. For most of the metrics, we had floodplain. We looked through, we did two different things. We did one review on floodplain monitoring methods and metrics. and updated all those. And we also looked at the study design. So we had a whole suite of metrics for floodplain, habitat, large wood, also looking at habitat suitability and for salmonids and other fishes. Most of these we can do with LiDAR, getting the topobathymetric surface out of the LiDAR, and hydraulic modeling to look at these and calculate these metrics at different flows. Now, the one thing about LiDAR is typically it's going to get returns over a square meter, the laser light detection and ranging, LiDAR. As it comes down, it's going to, the returns are on the order of 10 to 20 or more per square meter. So we could never have a field crew replicate that. I can't even get a field crew. If I had to cover, 100 hectares, I can't have a field crew out there with a survey instrument collecting a measurement every meter even. So the mapping is pretty high quality. And then for large wood, we can map a lot of it with aerial imagery, or we can use the LiDAR. And so these are some of the metrics. That just happens to be an image from something coming out of the LiDAR showing the water elevations and the topography on a relative elevation. These are some of the different metrics that we looked at. We tested this out on a handful of different large floodplain projects. This happens to be the county line project, which is down by Sumner. So the Pierce-King County line. And, this is making my point about if the changes are big enough, I probably don't need statistics. On the left side is the before restoration. There is a levee that's running down here in the covered with riparian vegetation. They set that levee back. So 5 years later, that's what the channel looked like. So big changes in the amount of the connection with the floodplain and the number of side channels. So the total wetted area at this flow increased more than 200%. Just a small increase in the floodplain area because the original levee was getting overtopped and flooding that area anyways, and then they constructed a big setback levee. But also big increase in the number of side channels. So real big success on that side. We didn't have before and after habitat data, but we're able to extract from the digital elevation model a longitudinal profile and use that to we developed an algorithm that our function to classify the habitats in the pools, riffles, and glides, and collected a little bit of field data to validate that. And so from that, we're able to do this without actually, with little field data. And we showed that, the pool area here increased by 70%. The number of pools went way up. And then we can do some habitat suitability index modeling. Now, it's not replacing fish monitoring, but it does give us some idea of whether those habitats are suitable. And what it does is it takes the outputs of the hydraulic model, so the depth and the velocity, you can put substrate in there as well. And it takes the habitat preferences, so those little curves I have up there, which I think I showed you before, are empirical based estimates of the preference for depth and velocity for different species. And it gives you this index from 0 to 1. And so this is just showing before and after. On the left, I have for juvenile Chinook, the amount of suitable habitat went up. This is the total area that is suitable, more than 400%. For spawning Chinook, not quite that high, but almost 50%, which is still pretty good. And then for each of these projects, we produced kind of a table or report card showing which metrics changed and how much. So for this, these really large projects, we can use a simple before after design. We can get most of what we need from LiDAR and hydraulic modeling. I did that again with drag my hand across the mouse. Just a second, the touchpad. There are some technical challenges that have still really been hanging us up, and probably at least a few of you have been saying, well, okay, you've seen increased fish numbers, but is that just concentration, or did you really actually increase the numbers of fish? And I did a review on that, and then more recently, Carlos Polivka, who's with the U.S. Forest Service, has been studying this on some streams in the Upper Columbia, and there really isn't much evidence that we're concentrating fish. We tagged fish and other things, but really, when you're looking at habitat, you can get more increased fish numbers by fish moving in, or the survival increasing, or you increasing the capacity, the amount of area that can support fish. From what we've seen in the literature and the studies that have been done, the studies that I've done and the Forest Service has done, it seems like we're getting increased survival and it's not concentrating fish. We're not talking about rockfish, like the concern over this came from studies where we build an artificial reef and the next day there's 20-year-old rockfish. We're talking juvenile salmonids. There's a new cohort every year. Project size and intensity. We talked about bigger projects. One question is, how big do the projects need to be? Not very few studies have looked at this. The Europeans looked at this. Daniel Herring looked at this in Central Europe, and they didn't see a relationship between the size and of the project. Though you would think that bigger projects, you probably have more well-functioning, the likelihood of restoring the processes is better, but we don't have a lot of evidence for that. I've talked mostly about most of the fish responses we've seen are at a reef scale. And monitoring things at a watershed scale, what is the population response is really the big question. And there are a whole suite of intensively monitored watersheds across the Northwest that have been trying to answer this question. Only a few of them have seen a population response. And really the gold standard is this work that was done down in the Alsea and the Nestucca, 30 years ago, where they restored an entire small watershed. They restored the whole thing and they saw a pretty big response. But that's still an open question. And then climate change. It's going to affect everything we do at rest. The planning and trying to determine where to do the restoration. We're going to see changes in temperature and flows that are going to affect that. Where we put where our restoration opportunities, that might change if the area is no longer suitable for salmon because it's too warm. The design, you've got to design projects for different flows now, a flow regime that's not what we know, and then just the monitoring and evaluation. So probably went over. I'm not leaving a lot of time, but just to kind of summarize, there's a science behind all these aspects. Designing successful restoration projects, there's a lot of science that goes into that at all these different steps. A lot of the techniques out there show some promise. Wood barriers and others we know are quite effective, but we could use more information on those large floodplain projects in particular. And really it's using remote sensing coupled with a little bit of field data is probably our best way to get at those. But there are a number of ongoing challenges, that population level response and climate change. So I think that's a quick overview on kind of the state of restoration science, what we know about that.
So all of these are measuring basically juvenile abundance.
Yeah.
What's the evidence it's actually rebuilding any of these endangered species?
Well, that gets that population level response.
Yeah.
Right? Not much. I mean, and you've probably seen there was an article by Bilby and others, a couple, I think it was 24 fisheries maybe. That why aren't we recovering salmon with all this work? The other part of that is the places that they've seen a real population level response, and I mean like smolt production or adults, like they did on the Alsea, the work on the Alsea and the Nestucca many years ago, they really did a lot of restoration. And if you look at how much, despite the amount of work we're doing, it's been spread out across the landscape. So most watersheds, less than 10%, probably less than 5% of the habitat has been restored. So we know this stuff will work at a local scale, but you have to apply it quite on a large percentage. And we did a study a while back that suggested you had to restore at least 30% of the watershed for us to detect the population level responses. So.
Words? So I'm not an expert on the whole thing, and I have more of a philosophical question. It's called habitat restoration, right? But it seems that the control is the unrestored habitat, and I'm looking for improvement.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is there actually a restoration goal that you're trying to achieve before you actually start? Or is it just only a habitat improvement project?
Yeah, so it's one thing to detect the grouping degraded habitat, showing change. Ideally, what we want to do is have a control and a reference being the ideal. And we just don't, in most cases, we don't have it. So, you know, the Europeans and particularly there's a bunch of work that came out of Austria where they call it the leap built, which I believe means like the target. And that's one of the things is to set a target. So one other way to look at the effectiveness of restoration is to set some targets and say, okay, great, you saw an improvement. What was the target? And when I was talking about those large floodplain projects where we're just doing that percentage change, let's see if I can find that. That's one of the things we were doing. We're working with the restoration practitioners saying, well, what is your target? So great, you saw a 50% increase. Was that was your target like 100%? You know, so I think that is an important point that one, it'd be nice to have references, but we need some targets for this. And we're really trying to get the restoration practitioners to set some in the beginning because a lot of them, they vary widely. Sometimes their goal will be improve floodplain connectivity and salmon. But then another one will say improve floodplain connectivity at a 2-year flow by this much. Those are rare. The ones that have really specific are rare. Most of them, it's a lot of hand waving. So there is a real need for that. That's a good point.
Yeah, sorry, go with your name. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think maybe a similar question on that. It was sort of about the LiDAR, correlation to like, it was increased, abundance of, these fish. And I'm curious, what are the applications? Like, I think because you were saying that, as the climate changes and, these populations will become more encroached, what might be the priority? Because, there's going to be places all over the world that are going to be experiencing that extreme. So like, would it be like we target fish populations that are being overfished and are experiencing effects of climate change? Or is it just like places that are just like really big abundance that are just depleted? Or is it kind of like a case by case basis? I'm curious, what are your thoughts on going about that?
So let me just paraphrase your question to make sure I understood it. So it's the question of like, where should you do the restoration? And if you've got both declines in the population, then we have climate change factors on that. How do you determine where to work? Is that, did I capture that? Yeah, that's one people are struggling with because one of the things we see is that there's places that we're like, okay, that, you know, we lost a ton of floodplain habitat. This population is depressed. Let's go restore that floodplain. And then we lay the predicted temperatures and flows under that for 2080, you know, from the climate models. And you're like, wow, that place is going to be too hot. You know, but the flip side of that is even some of the areas that are hot in the summer get used in the winter by other fish. So it's kind of complicated, and we have some approaches that can bring the temperature down. So there's a whole bunch of techniques, and floodplain restoration generally can ameliorate some of the impacts of climate change. It can help bring the temperatures down by more water storage, and also deal with some of the low flow issues by that. So it's not a great answer to your question, but it's a complicated one that we're struggling with.
Maybe I'll ask one last one, Phil. On one hand, you think, well, if we don't monitor anything, we don't learn anything. And then like the skeptics, the engineers are like, gosh, haven't we done this often enough? We can't monitor everything, the additional cost. Where do you draw the line? And presumably some of these things we know enough about the relationship between wood and pools and cove salmon. And so which are the ones that are going to require a higher proportion of monitoring, and which can we just say, well, we know enough, let's just implement?
Yeah, I think that that's a good question, and the techniques, I mean, techniques like barrier removal are pretty obvious. Wood placement is another one, when it's done right, can be highly successful, and I don't think it's so much monitoring. I mean, there's still a few questions about wood placement projects, how much are you increasing survival and some other specific things. But you know, we know that if it's done right, that will get a fish response. So those, I think, less. The floodplain stuff, the scale of the projects, the complexity of the projects, and they used to be years ago, they were doing we're gonna pull this levee out, we're gonna construct a side channel here. And now you go into a floodplain project that's covering a number of kilometers and they're pulling the levee out, they're putting wood in, they're planting a whole bunch of trees. I mean, they're doing like 10 different techniques at once. So those are more complex. I mean, I don't think you need to monitor every single project for effectiveness. But I would say that we still, though there's enough variability in those floodplain projects and we still don't know enough. And there's a lot of cases you're just kind of letting the river do the work, that a higher percentage need to be looked at. Right now, we're not looking at enough of them to, the percentage that are evaluated is really low. It's not even like one, I mean, I know I said like 5 or 10%. Of the projects that are out there, most of them, effectiveness monitoring, it's gotta be a couple percent are evaluated.
Why don't we stop? Thank Phil, and